Remember Taito? They're responsible for some of the most iconic arcade games of the 70s and 80s. But to be honest, I haven't actually played too many of them. Most of my Space Invaders experience comes from a knockoff called Avenger for the Commodore VIC-20. And then there's Bubble Bobble, but that's not really my thing. Back when I lived in Ohio, I was probably 8 or 9. I have this memory of going with my next door neighbor and his mom to Big Lots, and she said he could get a Nintendo game. Of course, that means you gotta pick something. So he ended up with this strange little game, Kiwi Kraze. I loved playing Kiwi Kraze at my neighbor's house. The character designs kind of made me think of Kirby, and I guess something about how it looked just appealed to me. But the coolest thing about Kiwi Kraze are these, I guess you can call them vehicles? You can steal these, maybe they're clouds from these gummy bears? And I think these are eggs? And like flying ostriches or emus or whatever. You hold the A button to fly up and release to fall. It feels very unique and satisfying. I do remember beating the first boss back then, but the game has limited continues and is actually fairly difficult. Between levels you'll see this island map. I seriously doubt that I knew back in 92 or 93 or whenever that Kiwi Kraze was set in a real place. And actually, if you live outside North America, you are much more likely to be familiar with Kiwi Kraze, but you know it by a different name, the New Zealand story. It's originally an arcade game from 1998, and it was ported to Master System, Mega Drive, Commodore 64, PC Engine, Amiga, and pretty much every other system of the day, especially consoles and computer systems that would be familiar to audiences in Europe, South America, and Japan. And as far as I can tell, the NES version was only released in North America and is the only version that North America ever got, until we got an arcade port on the Taito Legends compilation and a remake of sorts on the DS. I recently borrowed a copy of Taito Legends for the PS2 to see if the original arcade version could hold up to my nostalgia for the NES port. Obviously, the graphics are a lot more colorful and the sound is very different. As it turns out, the NES level design is actually pretty faithful to the original, but kind of compacted. Larger rooms use fewer tiles in the NES version, but the intent of the original design seems to carry over. One of the most significant differences is that the various vehicles control differently from one another. The ostrich things are fast and squirrely in the arcade version, but the eggs are kinda slow. Maybe they're actually tiny hot air balloons? The arcade also has vehicles and weapons that the NES version cut out, like the UFO, which is very easy to fly and shoots overpowered lasers. And the cane, which is simply an invincibility item on the NES, shoots fireballs that bounce all around the room. Warps are in the same locations in both versions, which are activated by shooting the empty space where they're hidden. The most interesting feature that was cut from the NES version involves heaven levels that you have a chance of visiting in areas 3, 4, and 5 when you get a game over. If you reach the goddess at the end of the level, you get an ending of sorts. What you actually want to do is avoid the goddess and find the secret exit, which lets you skip the rest of the level that you died on. Of course, having played the game on Taito Legends, which allowed for infinite continues, I didn't have to bleed quarters to reach the ending, but the game was still sufficiently brutal. Especially on the last level, which I spent over an hour on before I managed to get past its unforgiving slipperiness. So then I wanted to get an idea of what another console port was like, and I bought a copy of the Mega Drive version of the New Zealand story. I was particularly interested in this one because I read that it has totally different levels. almost like a sequel. Well, that's true to a point. Every level in the first area is new, aside from the returning whale boss. And the second area is different at first, until it starts to become Area 3 from the other versions, totally skips the second boss, and then takes you straight to a super frustrating version of the third boss. The third area continues to use recycled levels, and the memorable pirate ship is missing entirely. Level 4-1 is Mount Cook, the final level, making the whole game much shorter than the other versions, which end at 5-4. Despite being shorter and having more continues than the NES version, the New Zealand story on the Mega Drive is much more frustrating. I feel like it relies too much on mean enemy placement and overuse of enemies like these star things, which kill you by touch, unlike other enemies which kill you with attacks, something that I felt was relatively unique for a platformer in its day. So some of what made the game fun and special was taken away. I even expanded my Genesis's cartridge slot just so I could play it, and now I kind of regret that. Despite its less vivid graphics and the fact that some features are cut, the NES version still feels like the real deal. It has every level, aside from the heavens, and maybe it's my nostalgia talking, but it just feels right, and is easily my favorite of the 3 versions that I've played. A year or two after I left Ohio for Delaware, I learned through old-fashioned letters that my neighbor had gotten a Genesis. Not too long after that, I guess he got rid of his Nintendo stuff because what did I find in the mail but a package with Kiwi Kraze. I hadn't even had my NES hooked up since I got my Super Nintendo, but I did bring it up out of the basement just to play Kiwi Kraze for a few minutes. Since I didn't really play the NES anymore, I soon sold it and all of my games, including Kiwi Kraze, to help save up for the N64. When I later realized how stupid this was, I got another NES and began to build a new collection. I found a copy of Kiwi Kraze at my local Funko Land, and of course I had to have it. Who knows, it may even be the same cart. I mean, how many copies of Kiwi Kraze could have been floating around in northern Delaware anyway? Years later, in 2008, I was nearing the end of my gaming backlog, which was heavily populated by some tough NES games, Kiwi Kraze being one of them. And you know, it's not an amazing game or anything, but by the time I actually beat it, I'd had a lot of fun with it, and I do think it's pretty good, beyond just nostalgia. It's kind of weird that Square Enix now owns Taito, even sending out Space Invaders goodies as member rewards. I doubt we'll see a New Zealand story revival anytime soon, if ever. There's certainly a lot more popular and valuable Taito properties to choose from. But as for me, I'll always remember Kiwi Kraze as my Taito game.